This is an interview with Professor Mary Uhl-Bien. She's from the Department of Management, Entrepreneurship and Leadership at TCU in Fort Worth in Texas. And this interview was recorded in April 2018. Hello, I'm David Wilkinson. I'm the editor of the Oxford Review. And today what we're going to be doing is talking about a paper that herself and a colleague published called Leadership for Organisational Adaptability. Now, before we get on to the interview, there are a few key concepts that you need to understand to make sense of the paper. There's a research briefing about this that members have got. So the core idea that this paper's really kind of looking at is the idea of organisational ambidexterity. Now, what this means is organisations are actually trying to do two primary sets of activities. Firstly, they're trying to innovate, and that's innovate in the space of products, but also innovate in terms of business models, ways of working, processes, systems. Organisations are continually changing, and part of that change is innovative in nature. And the other side of this is exploitation or exploiting. So innovation requires creativity, testing and experimentation, which are considered to be kind of classical entrepreneurial activities. And exploitation requires systems, procedures, and particularly stability. And that's not least for ensuring quality. And there's a tension between these two things. Now, there's a number of previous studies that's been looking at organisational ambidexterity, and they've found that it's best if different people are involved in these two different processes. Now, what that necessarily means is within the organisation, there's a tension that starts to be created between the innovative side of the organisation and the exploitative side of the organisation, and the activities involved in those two things. And this leads to a kind of core question really for leaders and managers, and that is, how do you manage this process? How do you create organisational ambidexterity so that it's good at both things at the same time? And it's a really core question for just about any organisation anyway. And what Mary and her colleague Adrian did is that they've been doing quite a lot of work in this space about organisational ambidexterity, and they had a few realisations. So the first realisation is really around the types of leadership that are required for each of these activities. So on the one side, on the innovative side, you need somebody who's entrepreneurial, so you need entrepreneurial leadership. On the exploitative side, you need what we call operational leadership, so the ability to actually do the day-to-day running of the organisation, make sure that the products or services are going out and at the required quality, and that we're making sales or we're delivering whatever the service is. Now, the thing that they've added is this idea of enabling leadership, and you'll hear us talking in the interview about this core concept of enabling leadership. So that's the first new thing to come out of this paper, this idea that actually there are three types of leadership that are really involved in organisational ambidexterity. The second thing that really came out of it is the idea of an adaptive space. And that's quite crucial, and we'll talk quite a bit in the interview about what an adaptive space is, and that the role of the enabling leader is to create and hold an adaptive space, which is really about dealing with the tensions between entrepreneurial side of the organisation and the operational side of the organisation. And lastly, the last big idea to come out of the paper are that there are two processes that help in the adaptive space, and those processes are labelled as conflicting and connecting, and you'll hear Mary and myself talking about those two processes, conflicting and connecting. Now, before we go to the interview, I'd just like to introduce you to Mojo. Mojo's my daughter, who's home from university at the moment, her dog. There's a point during the interview at which Mojo wakes up and suddenly realises that he's shut into another part of the house. I actually recorded this this interview at home. So towards the end of the interview, there's quite a lot of barking, which I apologise for. Anyway, let's get on with the interview. Hello again, and today I'd like to introduce we're talking to Professor Mary Uhl-Bien, and she's Professor of Management in the Department of Management, Entrepreneurship and Leadership at TCU in Fort Worth in Texas. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, and what we're interested in is this paper, which is I came across recently, which is about leadership for organizational adaptability, a theoretical synthesis and integrative framework. So, Mary, can you just to kind of give us a bit of background, can you just take a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves, give the listeners a little bit of background about your personal journey so far and your academic history about how you got here in terms of your research interests?
Sure. So I'm the BNSF Railway Endowed Professor of Leadership at TCU here in Fort Worth, Texas. I've been here for 4 years, and prior to that I was in Nebraska. Prior to Nebraska I was in Florida, and then prior to that I was in Alaska.
Wow. And
we grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. So from all the moves, my husband and I realized that we must be high on sensation seeking. So you learn about yourself by seeing what you do. Yes. And we went from Cincinnati to Alaska, which was about as far as you could go in the country. And then we went from Alaska to Florida, which was about as extreme as you could go. We then went back up a bit, and now we're down. We decided we like the South and the warm. So we live here with our youngest son and our Siberian dog, which, poor thing, she's supposed to be in the north, and she's down here in the heat. And then my 2 older children, we left one behind in Nebraska, so he just graduated college there. Okay. And my daughter's actually in England, with all of you. So she's living in London right now. She graduated with her master's from Oxford last year.
Oh, really? In what? What was she doing?
She did it in evolutionary biology, which is a field in anthropology.
Yeah, okay.
She's working now with a company in London. They're doing data automation.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, great. Yeah. I hope she enjoyed herself at Oxford. I'm sure she did.
She loved it. You know, I think she got into it because of Harry Potter.
Really? That's fantastic.
Apparently Harry Potter is based on it. I wasn't aware of that, but she told me.
Yeah, a lot of the scenes were shot in the colleges here. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Oxford's a weird kind of place. I came here to do a master's and never left.
Yeah.
So it's just become a kind of a life choice. But
I can see that. It's a wonderful place.
Yeah, have you been?
I have, yes.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I love it. Anyway, great. So, that's fantastic. Can you just give us a quick overview about how you ended up doing this particular paper, the research that went behind it, and include any kind of previous research that you've been involved in that this was actually built on?
Sure. So I was not planning to do a PhD. I was recruited into the PhD program by George Grain, who studied leader-member exchange theory. He was the father of that theory. And I was in his undergraduate class, and I guess I was really obnoxious. I kept asking him a lot of questions and challenging with him and engaging with him. Yes. So he told me I had to come into the PhD program. And it was a time when there was a recession in the U.S. and the job market wasn't very good. So I came into the field that way, and I worked with him on leader-member exchange. And I always wondered why my view of leadership was a little bit different from the other scholars I've seen in leadership. I knew there was something different, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And I realized it's because I was trained in this model of leader-member exchange. And so I always saw leadership as a relationship. Yeah. And in that relationship with George, he was the mentor, and I was the protege. But our relationship was very much one of doing this. He brought me in because I would challenge him. So I would sit on his couch in his office for hours on end as we would just go at it. Yeah. And from all of that, we generated really creative work. Yeah. So that's how I view leadership. He trained me in the definition of that leadership is a relationship.
Yes.
So we studied leader-member exchange, and I then started getting into exec ed and working with practitioners. I was hired on as a consultant, And in doing that, I started to realize, I tried to consult and say, well, you need to build these relationships. And the leaders I was working with pointed out to me pretty quickly, that's not really my job. And so then I started to see the limitations of the theory that I was doing. And I really wanted to have a theory, spend time in research developing a theory that had rigor and relevance. So all of that set me up that I was looking for something different, something bigger and broader. And I was introduced to Russ Marion, who was doing research in complexity. And from that, we started doing complexity leadership. And we wrote our first paper in 2001. We continued that work. And so then in 2007, we got the theory hammered out. We started working on the empirical work. And this paper is the follow-up to all of that.
Got you. Now I understand the background of how you got to where it was. Interesting. Yeah, it's a fascinating paper, and it kind of pulls together a lot of thinking that hasn't been pulled together in this way, and certainly the whole area behind exploitation and exploration. Whilst there's been a lot of work done on that, actually pulling it together and working out how that works within an organisation particularly drew me to this. I suppose there's a few things that, from my point of view anyway, I found that is really new in the paper. Three main areas. The first one is the relabeling of three types of leadership required for developing adaptive capability in an organisation. That's entrepreneurial leadership, enabling leadership, and operational leadership. Do you just want to spend a couple of minutes talking across those three and what you mean by them?
Sure. And I was thrilled when you were writing me your overview that you actually got the gist of the paper. I thought, God, he really gets it. So when you were describing it and pulling out the pieces that really matter. To tell you how we got here, what happened was we had our 2007 paper when we wrote the theory, and we spent 6 years really deep trying to figure that out. It was not easy, and we had a lot of pushback, doing a lot of presentations to practitioners. So then we started collecting data, and we went out and we did a lot of qualitative work. We did some interventions, we did field studies, and as that work was unfolding, we kept getting calls from practice to come into their companies. So usually in research, what you do is you do a study and you publish it. Well, what was happening was this was going so quickly that we said, we're discovering so much, we don't want to just publish what we're doing, and we didn't want to stop and slow down. Yeah. So Michael Arena, who was my co-author, he was in practice. He got an opportunity to go to General Motors as their chief talent officer. He said, Mary, this is our living laboratory. We're going to see if we can make the theory in the 2007 paper work. And we had a lot of learning. So, if you armchair theorize, it's one thing. When you try to do it in the real world, it's quite different. So it took a year or two of Michael working it and then me interviewing him. So we were doing this study all along the way before we really started to have the ahas to say, now we've got it. And so Michael and I worked really hard to refine a model. We'd present it to practice, and we got it to the point where it was tight and solid. So now the challenge was, okay, how do we get it into academic research? And that was what I did with this paper, is we had so much, it's a massive framework, you can't put it down into one study, and had to figure out how we could get academics to understand this and ground this in theory. So this is all set up to tell you about the leadership styles. So what I realized in doing all of this is people were not resonating with the complexity idea. It was just too hard. People weren't going to go learn complexity theory, and while that's an incredibly rigorous grounding and theoretical framework for this, I really at the core of the model is about adaptability. So then I started looking for leadership for organizational adaptability and realized that it was being covered in all of these different areas. So I proposed this review piece. Well, I had no idea what we were going to find when we did the review. So we had all of our understanding from practice, no idea what we were going to find in the literature. But when we started looking and we found these different areas that were talking about it, what was so shocking was it all came together. People were finding the pieces of what we had found in our overall framework, and we were pulling from a lot of qual work, because the qualitative work is what many of these approaches use, or different kinds of approaches from just the survey work. So when we saw it, we pulled all of the different pieces, and it went into a nice, neat framework that we had developed from practice. And in that framework, what we did was we took the initial leadership styles that we knew about in the 2007 paper, and then just updated them. So if you look at the 2007 paper, the theory paper, we talked about it as adaptive and administrative, and then we had enabling in the middle. And what we discovered was we had the adaptive wrong. We were thinking adaptive was bottom up. Really, it's more the middle piece. There was a whole long story about how we figured that out. But then when we look at the literature, it became so clear. So figure 1 in this paper really shows it. Across all of these different areas, this is a very robust, resound finding that you have the two sides, but the adaptability lies in the middle. But nobody gets that. They don't really understand it. And it's like they're touching the different parts of the elephant. So what we did with this paper was pull it all together. So you've got entrepreneurial, you've got operational, which was the administrative piece, and then you have enabling. And with the entrepreneurial, what you're doing is you're pushing, that's that exploration. You're looking for innovation, learning, and growth. With the operational, you're pushing for results. So that's the administrative piece where organizations have managers who drive for results or operational leaders who do that. And then the enabling piece is the middle piece that's about adaptability. And what that does is work to enable adaptive space.
Yeah, brilliant. And actually the figure 1 diagram, can I just have your permission to reproduce this so I can send it to my members? Yeah, okay. Sure. Is a really...
I might need to ask Elsevier, but right now they're offering it free online, so I think you have permission probably.
I think you've got the copyright actually because it's yours. That's usually what happens.
No, they keep it.
Oh, do they? Oh, right. Yes. Anyway, I won't go. Oops. Yes, I know. Choose your publications wisely. Okay, that's great. The second idea that really comes out of this is the idea of leaders creating and holding an adaptive space. And for me, that was kind of the really big idea in all of this. So can you just explain what you actually mean by that?
Sure. So what we found in our research, and you can see this in an article that I wrote for Organizational Dynamics, that came out last year, and that was geared toward practitioners. The major finding we had in our work was that the world is more complex. In a more complex world, what that means is that the world has rich interconnectivity. So in this interconnectivity that we have, increased interconnectivity, rich means that when things come together and they interact, they fundamentally change each other. They create phase transitions, which leads to unpredictability, and it leads to dynamism and speed and all of these kinds of things. Well, in that world, you need to have complexity to respond to complexity. But the problem is that organizations drive to order. So our organizational systems are designed to go to order, which is a more bureaucratic or structured or standardized response. So organizations that live in complexity and that are highly adaptive and innovative, what they do is they don't go to order, they go to a complexity response, and they do that by using adaptive space. So adaptive space is conditions that allow for adaptability to occur in a system. They're not part of our natural organizations. So nowhere in an organization design, structure, chart, in a bureaucratic organizing system is this adaptive space. So what you need to do as a leader in organizations is you need to work to create that adaptive space. Now the nice thing is, what complexity does is it naturally opens that up. So when complexity happens, it creates these conditions in organizations where they have to adapt. But the problem is, what managers do and what employees want is managers to do is they close that back down. So when they're being disrupted or it's uncomfortable or they have tension or these complexity pressures, what they do is they take care of it, they fix it, they problem solve. Oh good, we got that one, that fire's put out, we fixed it, it's now going away, and we can go back to our happy lives. That's the order response. So you really need to be able to play in that adaptive space and to keep it open and use it appropriately.
And I think part of that's a about creating the space for people to be able to look for emergent properties. And quite often in organisations there isn't the time, and holding that adaptive space, allowing for noticing those things rather than creating, as you say, order, rather than actually creating certainty, allowing the uncertainty be and looking at the uncertainty and looking for patterns in that uncertainty. And that's part of the work that I've been doing, and that's one of the reasons why I connected so much with the paper, I think. Yeah, it's really interesting. And have you got examples of organisations that are actually holding an adaptive space?
So we have actually, yes, we started with the companies that were coming to us that said, we need help with this. And we have a whole bunch of those. And what we began to realize was, okay, we've studied this, but most of these are more bureaucratic. They're struggling with the adaptive space. So we need to go out and see if we study highly innovative and adaptive organizations, if they have it. Yeah. So we did a second follow-up study, validation study, after we developed our model with these highly innovative adaptive, and yes, this is what they do. Yeah. So we were doing things like looking at Facebook, which actually has been in the news this week. Facebook and Google and, a lot of the high-tech companies. We have another organization, WL Gore, which does Vortex, and they were one of the early ones that were really talking with us. Deborah France from WL Gore, who said, this is what we do at Gore that keeps us so innovative and allows us to have this different model. Michael then started doing it at General Motors. So he's had really good success in developing adaptive space and really has developed expertise. And the thought was, if we can do it in General Motors, we can probably do it just about anywhere. So I think we feel pretty confident that this is what organizations that are adept in this world, this is what they're doing.
Yeah, okay. And there's two kind of, the ideas of kind of conflicting and connecting kind of come out of the paper and writ large. Can you just explain what you mean by those and how they kind of affect practitioners?
Sure. Conflicting is the idea that you have heterogeneous worldviews. So you have different perspectives. When complexity happens, what's happening is that it creates pressures in the system. So it creates an adaptive challenge, meaning that you have to do something different. It creates conflicting perspectives or new partnerships. The second one is new partnerships. So adaptive challenge, new partnerships. In new partnerships, people have to come together and work together who haven't done so before. And that happens all over the place. Well, when those people come together, they have diverse backgrounds. So they have different needs, and they have different worldviews and different perspectives, different training, background. And so that creates this conflict in that relationship. And what often happens is people shut that down. So they try to get rid of the conflict. And what we know from complexity is that a core element of complex adaptive systems is tension, and what I was calling the tension dynamic for many years. And so we decided to use the word conflicting to get people to understand that what you need to do in organizations is engage that conflicting. And there's a way to do that. There are processes for it. People who are good at complexity know how to do this, bring the different ideas together, and that's what adaptive space does, is it brings these differences together in the right conditions to engage them, and you want that creative tension, that adaptive tension. So you play in the tension, but the other piece of it is conflicting is only good if you have connecting. So out of that conflicting, out of that diversity, when you have the heads butting, if you will, something sparks. So, and it's usually something that you haven't thought of before. That's where the creativity comes from. That's why they call it creative abrasion. And so you have to get really good at understanding to watch for those sparks and look for the areas where the connections can occur. Now that's in the creative process of adaptive space. But the really fascinating thing about this is in complexity we talk about these as fractals. And fractal means that it scales. It looks the same as it scales across the system. So this dynamic could occur between you and me, which is what I described George and I doing when I was sitting on the couch. That was my training. Russ and I did it as we developed this work together. So this is a core part of everything that went into this work. But that also occurs in the organization. So if we scale it up and think about it at a different level, when people have a new idea, let's take an entrepreneurial leader who has a new idea. That person starts to develop that new idea. That's socializing it in the local environment. And then the person, after they refine it a bit and decide it's got some legs, they decide, or a group decides, they're going to take it out into the organization and try to scale it to make it bigger. Well, what happens is when they take it out and they go bigger, it hits up against the other parts of the system.
Yep.
So that's conflicting. Now, for many people, they perceive that as hitting a brick wall.
Yes.
So they say, I've hit the brick wall, this is done, this idea is dead, and they quit.
Yep.
And what we're telling people is, no, this is the conflicting process. You need to change your mindset about that. You need to understand that is a conflicting process. You need to take that information back, iterate your idea, but figure out how you can get through that conflicting. And that conflicting goes all across the levels. It happens over and over again.
Yep.
So you're trying to get through the conflicting to do what we call linking up or connecting. So you then find a way, okay, David, I've just given you this idea. You say, no, it's not going to work. I take it back. I refine it. Now I come back to you again and I continue that, or I find a workaround until I can get a way to link up with you. And now we're linked up and you say, okay, this will work. And then you continue to do that process. So it's an ongoing, and they're really not separable. They're they work together as a dynamic, and it's a fractal dynamic. Pretty cool, huh?
Oh, it is. It's actually, I'm getting excited here because it fits in with some of the work that I was doing in the early 2000s when we were looking at, so my area is to do with uncertainty and leadership and how leaders cope or don't deal with uncertainty largely. And one of the leadership modes that kind of came out of that research was what we call mode 4, or generative leadership. And generative leaders have this ability to be able to hold the conflict and look for the patterns and look for the things within the conflict that are enablers and learn from it. And they're kind of inveterate learners rather than, and part of this is, and this is why I link emotion regulation so closely to generative leadership, is they don't run away because of the conflict. They move into it to see what they can learn from it. And they don't start forcing things on people. What they're trying to do, and it goes back to the whole thing about emergent property, is they're trying to find out what's going on here and trying to work out what the world view is and learn from different perspectives, so they become kind of collective of lots of different perspectives and diversity, and not diversity in sense of kind of just skin colour, but in the way that people think and see things, because that enables them to start to work out what's actually going on with the conflict. And it just dovetails so beautifully into some of the work that I've been doing for years. So,
that's
which
exactly
is why
it.
I got so excited.
Described it perfully.
We're gonna have to meet.
Yes.
Yeah, when you're in Oxford next. In fact, I will be coming to the States a bit later. But anyway, we'll talk about that afterwards. So, from practitioners' kind of perspective, because this whole thing's really for practitioners, is what should they really be taking away from your work and from this whole idea about adaptive spaces and the three types of leadership that you've come down to?
So the most important thing is to understand that the natural reaction in organizations and in systems is to go to the order response, to drive to results, to problem solve. Yep. And this is a huge problem for managers and for leaders because this is what we've trained them to do. So the problem with leadership is we've told leaders, yes, you're problem solvers, you're decision makers, here's what you need to do, build good relationships with your employees, which means make them feel good. And quite often, this is not a process that makes people feel good.
Yes.
People who are not comfortable with ambiguity or uncertainty, they've experienced this as extreme stress.
Yeah.
And so what managers do is try to make people feel better and take that stress away, fix the problem. That's one of the worst things you can do in this situation. So we have to be very, very careful that we understand that the role of leadership today in the conditions of complexity, and there's so much more of it, is to enable this adaptive space, enable the conflicting and connecting in that process, and that it looks very, very different from normal leadership. So we actually need to change our competency models. We need to change our recognition and reward systems, because leaders who do this, they don't look like what we've described as leaders or defined as leaders. And we're now in this current stage, we've got a practice group we're working with. We've got some really carefully hand-selected leaders we're tracking, because Michael already did it. We tracked him. Now we're tracking other leaders to see how they're doing.
Yes.
And they're not always recognized as leaders. They can be flying under the radar, or it can look like invisible leadership. Yeah. And the other challenge is they need a lot of coaching and support, because this is not an easy process to work through. And now we know some of those nuances of what's happening, so we need to get more information out to these leaders to say, here's what's going to happen, here are different stages of this, here's some warning signals, etc.
Yeah. Okay, that's...
Don't push just for results. I think that we've got to get organizations off this short-term push for results, focusing on, yes, results is current, but we need adaptability. To have adaptability, you need this entrepreneurial or innovation and the operational engaging in the tension to generate adaptability. So you need results and adaptability.
Yeah. It's beautiful. And actually, one of the ways that, just as you're talking, it kind of made me realise is that, we put leaders in organisations, and that's what they do. They organise. Unfortunately, what happens is they organise the living life out of complexity, rather than holding the space to learn about the complexity. They end up kind of getting rid of it and not learning, which is one of the big problems. Yeah, I'll send you some stuff actually after the interview that you might be interested in.
Love to see it.
Brilliant. Okay, so what's next for you in terms of research? What are you working on that you can tell us about right now? And where next?
So on the practice side, we have so much interest from practice. I have never had more practitioners contacting me, and so we've been prioritizing them. And I'm working to get a companion piece out to the Org Dynamics article that I published last year with Michael, and explain more about how you do this adaptive space, because in that one we gave the overview. In this next one we need to show more about how you do it. And then on the research side, we now have the new model, the revised model out, which we're thrilled about, and I'm so excited that you saw the paper and liked it. Thank you for that.
I love it.
And so the next step there is I want to write a piece on the tension dynamic.
Yeah.
Because really the core of this, on the academic side, the core of this is this tension dynamic, and people just don't understand it. So it's going to be similar to what I did with this other piece, where I look all over in the literature, because when I was doing the first review, I could see that there are insights there. So I'm going to call all of those findings, and I'll write that one up in terms of explaining more about adaptive space, and the tension dynamic is the core of that.
Brilliant. Excellent. I'll send you some references actually, because I've been doing quite a lot of work around this area. So there's some really interesting stuff. That's fantastic. That's brilliant. Is there anything else that you're working on in research terms? Sorry, that's my dog.
That would worry about doing this from home.
I know. Yes, I hadn't realised you could get through to there.
Yes. In research terms, I think, again, we're going to do the tension dynamic, the adaptive space, and then we have lots and lots of studies. So once we get the big picture out, then we're going to start providing more of those studies that I was describing. We'll go back and write those up. The challenge for us on the research side is that getting the world of academics to understand it. It doesn't fit into the nice, neat little box. And so you had asked me in the original framing about what practitioners should know about evidence-based.
Yes.
And what I would say is that be careful thinking that it's evidence, that what's being pulled from our literature is evidence. That, again, is some language that we use as academics, and there's a group of who are pushing it. And I agree with where they're trying to go. I just don't know if I agree with the evidence piece, because the idea that we have evidence using the methods that we use, to me, is questionable. A lot of those studies are perceptual. Yep. So the reason that I left the LMX work, because it was a 7-item measure of a perception of a relationship. And we would draw all of these conclusions that went way beyond the data.
Mm.
And I got really uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I knew there was much nuance to it.
Mm.
So I would say just there definitely are key findings or principles we know. There's no question. It's all basic principles that we've known from eons of research and just from our theory. So that's really good stuff. Just be careful about the idea that one study can be so informative.
Oh, yeah.
Look at the methods to see what's going on in those studies, and then understand that there's not a magic toolbox. You have to do the hard work of learning this stuff. And somebody's not going to come in and say, yeah, this study shows this, and I'm going to go implement this.
Yes.
That's really just not how it works.
Yeah, there's a whole series of things there, and in fact, I've just been writing some stuff on this about the kind of 4 areas for evidence-based practice that includes obviously academic research, but it also includes the practitioner's experience, feedback from the organisation, feedback from customers and clients, and these kind of 4 things that come into evidence-based practice. It isn't just the academic, and one of the things that actually drew me to your paper was the fact that it's grounded. It's actually based on, it's based on things in organisations as opposed to a theoretical base first.
Exactly. And that's what we did with our research. People were saying to me after I wrote the 2007 paper, you need to write a book. And I said, no, I need to go see how this works in the world. And yet, as I said to you, the reason we have not published a lot of papers is the academic world doesn't have a forum for getting that work out because it doesn't fit our typical research methods. So what we did is a combination of things, and I think that that's really what we need to do in research. We worked with so many practitioners. They were partners in this all the way through, and yet we still had the very solid theoretical grounding. So I like rigor and relevance, rigor in the theoretical side, relevance to practice.
Yeah.
That's right. Or impact. You could talk about impact. I like that better than this idea of evidence.
Yes. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, that's fantastic, and it's one of the reasons for the Oxford Review actually, because that gap between academic and practitioner is usually huge, and we're trying to kind of close that, and this paper does it beautifully.
And that's what happened here is that Michael is a practitioner. He's got a PhD in practice, and he's my partner in this work. We had our research team, but then Michael and I went off to try to do this work. So that's what you see in it. That's
fantastic. Mary, thank you very much for spending the time with us. I'll be in contact anyway. I've got some things to send you, and just thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been really wonderful.
That's great. You take care, and
okay,
I'll talk to you again soon. Anytime you're in.